I was never the kind of person who believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, curses, all that stuff seemed like a way for people to make sense of random, unexplainable events. But then, something happened that changed all that. And unfortunately, it happened because of my niece, Emily. Emily was a quiet kid, almost unnervingly so. She was only 8, but had this way of looking at you as if she could see right through to your thoughts. Her mom, my sister, said it was just a phase. All kids go through it. She'd shrug. She's just a bit peculiar. I guess she had a point. But something about the kid felt off, especially after I started babysitting her. One weekend, my sister and her husband were heading out of town, so I agreed to watch Emily at their house. The first night went by without any trouble. Emily barely talked, but she followed instructions, brushing her teeth, putting on her pajamas, getting into bed. No complaints, no tantrums, just silence. A little eerie, but manageable. It was the second night when things started to get strange. I was making dinner when I heard Emily in her room, talking to herself. She hadn't spoken a word to me the whole day, so hearing her voice startled me. I moved closer to the door, listening. She was murmuring softly, like she was having a conversation with someone. "Who are you talking to, Emily?" I asked, poking my head into her room. She turned and stared at me, her expression blank. "No one," she replied, and turned back to her little desk in the corner. On it was a small, battered drawer that looked out of place among her other toys and books. It was old, with peeling paint and a few odd symbols etched along the edges. I'd never seen it before and was sure it wasn't something her parents would buy. "Where did that drawer come from?" I asked. She shrugged. "I found it." I stepped into the room and knelt by her side, feeling a chill that I tried to shake off. "Where did you find it, Em?" Her eyes flickered toward me, a smirk curling on her lips that made my skin crawl. "In the basement." Now, I'd been in their basement a few times before. It was mostly used for storage, full of old holiday decorations and the usual clutter. If there had been a drawer like that down there, I'd never noticed it. "Emily, you shouldn't be taking things from the basement without asking," I said, trying to sound firm. But she just kept looking at me with that strange, knowing smile. "It's special," she whispered. "It holds secrets." Later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emily went to bed without a fuss, as usual, but her words echoed in my head. It holds secrets. The drawer had to be an antique, probably left by the previous owners. But that didn't explain her behavior, or the way she seemed to be hiding something. Around midnight, I heard a creaking sound coming from the hallway. I thought it might be Emily going to the bathroom, but when I checked her room, she was still in bed, eyes closed, breathing softly. Then I heard it again, a low, drawn-out creak. I followed the noise down the hallway, feeling an increasing sense of dread. It was coming from the basement door, which was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it earlier. I stepped down the stairs cautiously, flashlight in hand, trying to tell myself it was probably just the house settling. But as soon as I reached the bottom, the light in the basement flickered on, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. I hadn't turned it on. And there, in the middle of the floor, was the little drawer, sitting open. Inside was a single small note, folded neatly. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I unfolded it. The handwriting was childlike, scrawled in thick, shaky letters. "Look inside me." I was about to put the note back when I heard a soft, whispered giggle. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. No one was there. The only sound was the faint hum of the basement lights and the thumping of my heart. I backed up toward the stairs, trying to calm my breathing. Just as I reached the top, I heard Emily's voice. She was standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at me with a blank expression. "You shouldn't go in there," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It doesn't like it." I didn't know what to say. Her eyes were distant, as if she were looking right through me. Then she turned and walked back to her room without another word. That night I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the house made my nerves prickle. Around 3 in the morning, I heard another noise coming from Emily's room. This time it sounded like scratching. I went to check on her, heart pounding. When I opened the door, she was sitting up in bed staring at the wall. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. Her fingers clawed at her sheets, scratching at them over and over. I whispered her name, but she didn't respond. "Emily," I repeated a bit louder. She finally blinked, looking up at me with an expression of confusion. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She nodded slowly, glancing toward her desk where the drawer now sat closed. "It's okay," she murmured. "It just likes to play sometimes." I didn't know what to do. I considered calling my sister, but what could I say? That her daughter was acting strange because of an old drawer? I decided to wait it out, hoping this phase would pass. The next day I tried asking Emily about the drawer again. "What kind of secrets does it hold?" I asked, forcing a smile. Her eyes darkened, and she looked up at me, her expression suddenly cold. "Bad ones," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The kind you don't want to know." That night, after I put Emily to bed, I sat in the living room, trying to make sense of everything. Around midnight, I heard that same creaking sound. The basement door had opened again. This time, though, I heard footsteps, soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. I grabbed a flashlight and went down, my entire body tensed. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the drawer was open again, another note lying inside. "Come see me." My hands shook as I read it, and I felt a cold presence behind me, like a breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I backed away slowly up the stairs, keeping my eyes fixed on the drawer. Just as I reached the top, I heard a voice, a child's voice, echo from the darkness of the basement. "Emily?" I slammed the door shut, heart pounding. The voice wasn't mine, but it was hers, clear as day, calling her own name. The next day, I confronted Emily, desperate for answers. "What's going on with that drawer? Why did you bring it up here?" She looked at me, her expression vacant. "It was lonely. It wanted to come home." When my sister returned that evening, I was beyond relieved. I told her everything, but she just laughed it off, saying Emily had an active imagination. I tried to insist that there was something wrong, but she waved me off, saying it was probably just a phase. Before I left, I glanced at Emily one last time. She was sitting in her room staring at the drawer, her small fingers tracing the symbols along its edges. She looked up at me, and for the briefest moment, I saw something in her eyes. Something ancient. Something that didn't belong in a child. "Goodbye, Uncle," she said softly, her voice tinged with a dark, knowing tone that sent a chill down my spine. That was the last time I ever babysat Emily. My sister said her phase eventually passed, that she grew out of it. But I've never forgotten that weekend, or the way Emily's eyes seemed to change when she looked at that drawer. I can't shake the feeling that something is still there, lurking in her room, hiding in that small, battered drawer, waiting for the next person who dares to open it. I'll never forget the first time I heard about Emma's friend. I was 16 and babysitting was my go-to for extra cash. I'd looked after a lot of kids, so it was rare anything really rattled me. But Emma, there was something off. She was a quiet, pale little girl of 7, with dark, unblinking eyes that always seemed to be watching. Her parents, the Galloways, were polite but distant, quick to hand over the usual babysitter checklist before darting out the door. It felt like they couldn't leave fast enough. The first few hours with Emma were uneventful. We did the usual things, drawing, playing with her stuffed animals. She was polite, a bit too quiet, but I just chalked it up to her being shy. It wasn't until bedtime that things took a weird turn. I was tucking her in, fluffing her pillow, when she looked at me with those dark, steady eyes and whispered, "Can you make sure the closet door is closed all the way?" I looked at the closet door, perfectly closed. "It is closed, sweetie," I said, trying to sound cheerful, Emma's gaze didn't waver. No, not the closet door in here, the one in the basement. That caught me off guard. I didn't remember the Galloways mentioning a basement. And it seemed strange for a 7-year-old to worry about a closet that wasn't even in her room. But I shrugged it off, assuring her that everything was fine and I'd check it later. She didn't seem convinced, but eventually lay down, hugging her stuffed rabbit. I waited until I was sure she was asleep before I left her room, but I couldn't shake that unsettled feeling. I checked the house a bit more, peeking into rooms, making sure all the doors were closed. But when I opened the door to the basement, I hesitated. A faint, musty smell drifted up, mixed with something else. A sharp, metallic tang that made my skin crawl. The basement was pitch black, but as I flicked on the light, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just an old, damp storage area cluttered with forgotten boxes and dusty furniture. But in the far corner, there was a small door I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind some boxes. I walked over, something about that door tugging at me, and gave it a firm push. It barely budged. When I managed to get it closed, a soft, almost imperceptible click echoed through the basement. I shivered, realizing just how cold it was down there, and quickly turned off the light, heading back upstairs. Emma was still asleep, her little face peaceful. I told myself it was just a kid's overactive imagination, and I tried to focus on my homework. But around midnight, the house felt colder, like someone had left a window open. I checked each room, closing windows that were somehow wide open, though I'd swear they'd been shut tight. Just as I settled back down, I heard it. A faint rhythmic sound, like someone whispering. My first thought was Emma was having a nightmare, but as I climbed the stairs, I realized it wasn't coming from her room. The whispering was coming from the basement. My heart pounded as I crept down the stairs, each creak of the old wood echoing in the silence. The sound grew louder, though it was still soft, like it didn't want to be heard. My hand hovered over the basement door handle, but something in me froze. I was certain that if I opened that door, I'd regret it. Suddenly, I felt a tug on my shirt. I spun around, finding Emma standing behind me in her pajamas, her face as blank as ever. "You closed it, right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Closed what?" "The closet door. You closed it tight, didn't you?" Her eyes were huge, dark, and unblinking, as if something was looking out from behind them. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "Emma, why do you want the basement closet closed so badly?" She looked at me with a seriousness that felt too heavy for a child. "Because that's where he lives." "Who lives there?" She paused as if considering whether to tell me. "The man. He told me his name, but it's hard to remember. He likes to talk to me at night when it's quiet. He says he's lonely." There was something about the way she said lonely that twisted my stomach. I was rooted to the spot, watching as Emma turned and walked back toward her room. Before she closed the door, she looked back at me, her eyes dark and distant. "He said he's happy you're here tonight. He doesn't get to see many people anymore." That was it. I was done. I texted Mrs. Galloway, asking her if she could come back early because I wasn't feeling well. She didn't respond right away, so I paced the living room, my heart pounding. An hour passed before I heard footsteps outside. Relieved, I went to open the door, only to find no one there. The porch was empty, the night was dead silent. But as I closed the door, I heard the unmistakable creak of footsteps coming from the basement, slow and deliberate. I froze, barely able to breathe. I wanted to run to get out of there, but then I remembered Emma was still upstairs. I couldn't just leave her. Forcing myself to move, I headed up to her room, only to find her standing at her window, staring out into the night. I approached her slowly, almost afraid of what she'd say next. She didn't turn around, but in a low, almost detached voice, she whispered, "He says you shouldn't go in the basement. He doesn't like it when people see him." "Emma," I said, my voice shaking. "Who are you talking about?" She finally turned to me, and the expression on her face was one I'll never forget. There was no fear, no sadness, just an eerie calmness. You don't need to be afraid. He only takes people when he's lonely. And now that you've met him, he says he'll never be lonely again. I backed away, my mind racing. I heard a car pull up outside, and I nearly sprinted to the door, yanking it open to find Mrs. Galloway stepping out looking confused but concerned. I quickly explained that Emma had been talking about someone in the basement, that I'd heard footsteps and whispers. Mrs. Galloway's face went pale, but she quickly masked it, offering a strained smile. "Thank you for staying with Emma," she said, her voice tight. "I'll take it from here." I didn't need any more encouragement. I bolted out of that house, still feeling Emma's eerie stare on my back. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a strange, creepy night. But a few weeks later, I heard something that confirmed what I'd feared. A friend from school mentioned that Emma and her family had moved suddenly, right after I'd babysat. The new family that moved in lasted less than a month, leaving after claiming they'd been haunted by something in the basement. To this day, I can't look at a basement door without feeling that same cold dread creep up my spine. I'll always wonder if Emma's friend is still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting patiently for his next visitor. I'll never forget the first time I met Ellie. She was barely 4 years old with long, unbrushed hair that hid most of her face. Her small, pale fingers clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, its fur matted from years of holding. Ellie was my cousin, but until that day I had never heard of her. It wasn't until my Aunt Sarah passed away suddenly that Ellie came to live with us. My mother explained it as some family estrangement, one of those murky adult secrets they tried to hide from me. Ellie was quiet. When she first arrived, she didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just stared at me with those dark, unblinking eyes, like she was trying to understand me. I was 15 at the time, and the responsibility of watching over her quickly fell to me. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in short, hushed whispers, like someone who feared they'd be overheard. The first few nights were difficult. My mom thought it best if Ellie slept in my room until she got comfortable, so I dragged a mattress onto the floor by my bed. I couldn't sleep well with her there. I'd wake up in the dead of night and feel her eyes on me, just watching. She wouldn't be asleep, just lying there clutching that rabbit and staring. I tried to ignore it, turning away, pretending I didn't notice. But one night, curiosity got the better of me. "Ellie," I whispered, barely loud enough to hear myself. "Why don't you sleep?" She blinked at me, her eyes wide and unreadable. For a moment I thought she wouldn't answer, but then, in that barely there voice of hers, she replied, "I don't like the dark. I can see things. Moving." I felt a chill run down my spine. She said it so calmly, as if she were talking about the weather. But the way her eyes flicked to the corner of the room made me feel like there was something she wasn't telling me. "What do you see?" I asked, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. She hesitated, fingers tightening around the rabbit's ear. "A man. He stands in the dark, and sometimes he talks to me." It was such an odd thing for a child to say, but I dismissed it as her imagination. "It's just shadows, Ellie. There's no man in the dark." She didn't argue, just looked back at the corner, where the shadows seemed denser than usual. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows, set my nerves on edge. Days turned into weeks, and Ellie remained a strange, unsettling presence in our home. My mother seemed unbothered, brushing off her odd behavior as adjusting to her new surroundings. But I knew something wasn't right. One night I was up late studying, the soft glow of my desk lamp casting shadows around the room. Ellie was asleep on her mattress, or at least I thought she was. When I glanced over, she was sitting up, staring at the corner with an expression I couldn't read. "Ellie?" I whispered. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. Slowly, she lifted her hand and pointed to the corner. I felt my throat tighten, a strange pressure building in the room. There was nothing there, just shadows. But the way Ellie was looking, the intensity of her gaze made my skin crawl. "Can you see him?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I wanted to tell her no, but something about the darkness in that corner looked wrong, like it was thicker, more solid. I blinked, and for just a second I thought I saw a shape. It was tall, hunched, with something that looked like a face twisted in a silent scream. I turned away, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, Ellie was back to her usual silence, as if the night before had never happened. But the incident left me shaken, and I began to pay closer attention to her, hoping to find some explanation. One evening, I was going through some of my aunt's belongings that had come with Ellie. Most of it was just old clothes and toys, but then I found a small leather-bound notebook, worn and cracked. The first page was filled with a strange scrawl that seemed more like scribbles than actual words, but as I flipped through, I found entries, short, fragmented, and increasingly erratic. The entries were written by my aunt, Sarah. They started off normal enough, talking about Ellie's birth and her early years. But then around Ellie's third birthday, the tone shifted. Sarah began writing about Ellie seeing a man in the shadows and talking to things that weren't there. She mentioned strange noises, Ellie's odd behavior, and her refusal to sleep. The final entry, though, made my blood run cold. Ellie told me the man speaks to her. He tells her things she shouldn't know. Things only I know. I don't know what he is or what he wants, but I fear he's come for her. I dropped the notebook, my hands trembling. My aunt had known something was wrong, something she couldn't explain. But the most disturbing part was that she never mentioned any of this to my mother or anyone else. She'd kept it hidden, as if she feared speaking it aloud would make it real. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m, I heard it. A faint whisper. It was so soft, like someone speaking from a distance just out of earshot. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound was coming from Ellie's mattress. I watched as she sat up, her head tilted to one side, eyes fixed on the corner of the room. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but her voice was different. Deeper, almost guttural. It didn't sound like a little girl's voice at all. A shiver ran through me, but I forced myself to speak. "Ellie, who are you talking to?" She didn't respond, just kept murmuring. The words a low, steady chant that seemed to vibrate through the room. And then suddenly, she stopped. She turned to look at me, her eyes dark and empty, and said, in that strange, hollow voice, "He's coming for you next." I froze, my heart slamming against my chest. Before I could react, Ellie lay back down, pulling her stuffed rabbit close and closing her eyes as if nothing had happened. I sat there stunned, every inch of me screaming to get out of that room. The next day I told my mother what happened. She brushed it off as childish imagination and told me to stop scaring myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something seriously wrong with Ellie. Something that went beyond what any of us could understand. A few nights later, I woke up to find Ellie standing beside my bed, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her mouth twisted in a strange, almost sad smile. She reached out, her fingers cold against my skin, and whispered, "He wants to be friends." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I begged my mom to move Ellie out of my room to find someone else to take care of her. She agreed reluctantly and moved Ellie into the guest room down the hall. But even after she was gone, I felt his presence. The shadows seemed darker, thicker, and sometimes late at night I would hear that faint guttural whisper coming from the hallway. It always stopped when I got up to check, but the feeling of being watched lingered, like something was always just out of sight. Ellie stayed with us for only a few months before a distant relative offered to take her in. My mom packed her things, and just like that, she was gone, Our house felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive, but I couldn't forget those last words she'd said to me. Years later, I heard that Ellie had been institutionalized. She had stopped speaking altogether, except for one phrase she would repeat over and over again. "He wants to be friends." To this day, I can't sleep with the lights off.